We'll get started then with a quick word of prayer. Lord God, we thank you for the opportunity to meet here and hear your word. Help your word inspire us and help us motivate us to become better Christians, not only today, but all the days to come. Amen. So, last time we met, we had all kinds of intrigue. I'm thinking that we got a camera person and we got a bunch of actors, so we'll do the soap opera, the Book of Esther, I think. There you go. But in all seriousness, a whole lot of things happened in the last session that were somewhat unexpected. For example, if you remember, Haman was the most trusted advisor. What happened to him?
He got hung.
He got hung. Now, why did they hang him? Why did they hang him? Did he steal a horse or what?
He had a plot to kill Mordecai, and Mordecai had saved the king.
Mm-hmm. Well, as it turns out, Esther had that banquet and pointed out to the king about his order that he never remembered even making to destroy the Jews, and whose idea was that? His. So next thing you know, he gets hung. So now Haman's out of the picture. Now who's the new royal advisor? Mordecai is.
Yeah.
So Mordecai is now the new advisor, and so what exactly does Mordecai now have that the royal advisor, is allowed to have? Very important thing.
A ring seal.
Yeah, the signet ring, the seal. I still remember The Prince of the Pauper, the original one, where they're trying to figure out which one is the real prince, because the king had died. And they said, certainly the prince should know where the royal seal is. Well, where is the royal seal? And the imposter says, "Oh, you mean that big thing?" Well, yeah, where is it? He says, "I've been using it to crush walnuts with." So, the royal seal is usually a very, very important thing to have. All right, so then remember, the king, once a king makes an order, he can't take it back. So what exactly did the king do to resolve the situation, or at least start it on that way?
Another order.
And what was that?
Rescind the last one.
No, he couldn't do that.
They're not allowed to do that.
Not allowed to do that.
That the Jews.
So he made a new one, but what exactly did the new one say?
That the Jews could defend themselves.
Exactly, and Mordecai signs it, and then what does he do? He sends the royal couriers out. Remember that? That was like the Pony Express that went to all parts of the empire, all the way to Ethiopia, and so that is where we are. So now let's turn to chapter 8 of Esther here, and that should be easy to find. Chapter 8 should be somewhere around page 5, or what is that, 527?
Yeah.
All right, I need somebody to read verses 15 to 17.
I'll do it. Mordecai left the king's presence wearing royal garments of blue and white and large crown of gold and a purple robe of fine linen. And the city of Susa held a joyous celebration. For the Jews it was a time of happiness and joy, gladness and honor. In every province and every city, wherever the edict of a king went, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with the feasting and celebration, and many people of other nationalities became Jews, because fear of the Jews had seized them. So they all joined up.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a big party going on. First of all, it says in the Citadel City itself, where all of a sudden, here is Mordecai, the Jewish fella, is now revered among all the citizens. Even though in a few days there's an order to go out and wipe out him and everybody else. Okay, so that is Important for you to know. Now, the other thing is, look at the description of the robe. With a large crown of gold, a purple robe of fine linen, and in blue and white. It turns out that blue was a very rare color in those days. It was like almost as revered as purple was. So you're talking about something that the average person certainly could not afford to wear. And not only that, if he goes around wearing that, what do you think? Do you think people are going to notice?
I was gonna say, everybody will know who he is,
Everybody will know who he is now, yeah. Well, they may not know him as a person.
but they'll know he's somebody, huh?
Yeah, they'll know what his position is. So all of this has happened, went from, remember Mordecai was so upset he tore his clothes sitting in front of the gate, and now he's in royal robes doing the king's work, and he has armed the Jewish people as far as we know. And so now the Jews are able to defend themselves, and like you said, Dave, all of a sudden everybody's joining up. They said, well, you know, you can't beat them, join them.
They became Jews?
Yeah.
That's what it says.
Yeah, that's what it says.
How do you become a Jew?
Oh, there is a ritual for it. Anybody can become Jewish if you want. There's a whole ritual as far as the studies and everything else, and in our case, circumcision and the whole bit. You know, there's a.
The famous one that became Jewish was Sammy Davis Jr. He converted to being a Jewish person.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of faith versus culture.
Right, exactly. Anybody can become a Jewish person, but it's like in the old days when you wanted to become a Catholic. Any of you ever been to Church of the Covenant? It's across the street from University Hospital, the University Circle. It turns out Church of the Covenant is built the same way a European cathedral would be built. And so you got this main area of the sanctuary, and off to the side is a bunch of pillars, and there's a bunch of pews over there. In the old days, anybody who wanted to become a Catholic had to sit over there until they were, you know, went through the catechism and all that sort of stuff. Then they were allowed to sit on the other side. So there is a ritual for everything. We Presbyterians, we sit you down for an hour, and as long as we find out you really care, then membership is usually bestowed on you. But for the Jewish people, it takes months, and in my
You have to go through all kinds of classes and stuff.
yes, you
like that.
do, yeah, and you know, you have to know the scriptures
Yeah.
and all that. In my day, in order to be Catholic, the kids had to go to catechism, and this was for years. So so anybody can become Jewish, and but be that as it may, the next thing that happens is what happens on the day when these attacks are supposed to occur. So would somebody read for me Esther 9 verses 1 to 11?
I'll read it. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them. But now the tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities and all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those seeking their destruction. No one could stand against them, because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them. And all the nobles of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king's administrators helped the Jews because fear of Mordecai had seized them. Mordecai was prominent in the palace. His reputation spread throughout the provinces, and he became more and more powerful. The Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. They also killed Pershadatha,
Alpha,
Alpha,
Aspatha. Baratha.
Just a bunch
Okay,
of.
Just a
why
bunch
don't
of
you just
people.
read it?
Yeah, that's just.
Read it out. Okay, the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. The number of those slain in the citadel of Susa was reported to the king.
There's only one free word.
That same day.
That same day,
It is not that, sorry.
the page is stuck together.
Of course it is, for 3 words. The next 3 words are that same day, and that's what it is. Okay. All right, now, so, like you said, they joined up. So a bunch of people joined up, and a whole lot of others decided that maybe since Mordecai was the boss now, this might be a good thing for them to support. So it looks like the Jews were able to withstand this attack. Okay. Now, Dave asked in the last Bible study, why are the Jews so hated? Well, you can see they were hated even back then.
Yeah.
And so here was a case where they stood up to their, shall we say, enemies. Let's put it that way.
Why didn't they take over the plunder?
That's a good question. I guess they figured that. Once Haman and his sons were out of the way, that was enough. I can't think of any other good reason.
Basically, it says in my Bible that there was a thing in the past that when they took the plunder, then bad things happened.
Mhm.
So as a general rule, they did not take the plunder any longer. And this occurred at the time of Saul.
Okay. So the point of the matter is, if you recall, Haman was boasting about how much he owned and how many sons he had and all of his household and everything. So there was a lot of stuff there, that's for sure. So, that was the first day. Now, would somebody like to read verses 12 to 16?
Yeah, I will. The king said to Queen Esther, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman in the citadel of Susa. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? It will also be granted. She makes out no matter what. If it pleases the king, Esther answered, give the Jews in Susa permission to carry out this day's edict tomorrow also, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on gallows. So the king commanded that this be done. An edict was issued in Susa, and they hanged the 10 sons of Haman. Holy schmoes. The Jews in Susa came together on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they put to death in Susa 300 men, but they did not lay their hands on plunder. Meanwhile, the remainder of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also assembled to protect themselves and get relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but did not lay their hands on the plunder. Holy schmoes.
So, anyway, so you can see that this was not just a local skirmish, like.
75,000, that's a lot.
That's a lot, yes, that's almost, that's more than twice the entire population of the city I live in.
Yeah, but during World War II, supposedly 6 million Jews were killed.
Right, exactly.
That's a lot more than 75,000.
Well, unfortunately,
Yeah.
that still doesn't come up to the Battle of Antietam, but be that as it may. So basically, the Jews everywhere were able to defend themselves, at least as far as we know. This is what it says. We don't know for certain that everything was as nice and as wonderful as this sounds, but because there could have been a province or two where the Jews lost, we just don't know. But remember, I remember that map I showed you how big that territory was, and supposedly went all the way down to Africa, to Ethiopia. I mean, how they were able to know in one day what the situation was is beyond me, but let's assume that they did. So there was a second day. So now I need someone to read verses 17 to 32, because let's find out if there was a third day.
Okay, I can go go to that one. This happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. The Jews in Susa, however, had assembled on the 13th and 14th, and then on the 15th they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. That is why rural Jews, those living in villages, observed the 14th of the month of Adar as a day of joy and feasting, a day for giving gifts to each other. Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy, and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews agreed to continue the celebration they had begun, doing what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast a pur, that is a lot, for their ruin and destruction. But when the plot came to the king's attention, he issued written orders that the evil scheme Haman had devised against the Jews should come back onto his own head, and that he and his son should be hung on gallows. Therefore, these days were called Purim, from the word pur, because of everything written in this letter, and because of what they had seen and what had happened to them. The Jews took it on themselves to establish the custom that they and their descendants and all who join them should without fail observe these 2 days every year in a way prescribed and a time appointed. These days should be remembered and observed in every generation by every family, and in every province, and in every city. And in these days of Purim should never fail to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should the memory of these days die out among their descendants. So Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, along with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm the second letter concerning Purim. Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews in the provinces of Xerxes' kingdom, words of goodwill and assurance, to establish these days of Purim at their designated times, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther decreed for them, and as they had established for themselves and their descendants in regard to their times of fasting and lamentation. Esther's decree confirmed these regulations about Purim, and it was written down in the records.
Okay. So, do they still celebrate Purim?
Boy, this they should.
Oh, but do they? You don't know?
I don't know,
They do.
I'd say yes.
they probably do, but.
They do. It was March 23rd and March 24th this year. And I have to say it that way because the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar, and it does not match ours. So, for example, Passover and Easter are usually together. This year, Passover was 3 weeks later because of the difference in the calendar. So you have Purim in March, and about 5 weeks later is the Feast of Passover. And so basically the Jewish faith has a number of these celebrations, and each one is designed to do something different for someone. What was the Feast of Purim designed to do? You know, who is the beneficiary from that?
Jews are into to celebrate the victory over their enemies.
Yeah, well, how do they celebrate it?
They feast
Who did they give gifts to?
each other.
Poor,
They gave gifts to the poor,
and
This-
gifts of food to one another.
and gifts of food to one another. There's another one, the Pentecost, where the first parts of the harvest are gathered up and shared. I mean, this is the way these things.
But do they still do it that way now?
I'm not sure what exactly they do, but yes, they do have a celebration. I imagine they do give to the poor. So this is something that goes all the way back to this time, and as I said, the festivals that the Jewish people have are extremely important to their faith. And they're spaced out enough so that it's every couple of months when you stop and think about it.
When they give to the poor, do they give to the poor Jews or to poor anybody?
I don't know, I can't answer that. But I know they still do that. Now, who their charities are, I have no idea. I'm sure they have one. I mean, they've been giving alms in synagogues for centuries. You know, there was an alms box, and what that did is it took care of the poor. And that's like the first vestiges of what we might call an offering. And the Catholics still have a poor box.
Yeah, they still do.
Yeah, and that's where that idea came from. So who they give it to, I don't know, but it was up to, in the case of the synagogue, it was up to the president of the synagogue to determine who would be getting the gifts and whatnot. And that's what he was called. Now, I don't know what the Jewish name for president is, but you know, they didn't have what you call a pastor. They had a president of the synagogue, and they also had a keeper of the scrolls. Because those were very extremely rare and extremely important. So somebody was responsible for making sure that nothing happened to them. They were put away and kept safe and all that sort of thing. As far as preaching was concerned, they would just invite people. That's why Jesus was able to preach in a synagogue from time to time, because the president of the synagogue invited him to speak. So these roots go all the way back in through the centuries, and they're still celebrated today. Just as Passover is, Hanukkah is, Feast of Weeks is, Feast of Tables is, and so on. All right, now, whatever happens to Mordecai? Would somebody like to read chapter 10? It's real short.
I got it. King Xerxes imposed tribute throughout the empire to its distant shores, and on the acts of power and might, together with a full amount of greatness to Mordecai, to which the king had raised him, are they not written in the book of Annals of Kings in Media and Persia? Mordecai the Jew, the second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by the many fellow Jews, because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews.
So, you will find that in the Jewish faith, Mordecai, he's not quite up there as far as Moses and Elijah, but they know who he is. And he's considered one of the stalwarts of the faith over the centuries. And so now we know about Esther, now we know about Mordecai, now we know about the Feast of Purim. You've read the entire book. There is one word that has not been used that you would fully expect to be in a book of the Bible. What was it?
I don't know, I searched this over and over and I cannot come up with a word that,
God.
God. The word God is not used anywhere in this book. Anywhere. The word Holy Spirit is not used anywhere in this book. The word prayer is not, she prays a couple of times, but that's about as far as it goes. And it does not say who she prays to. The word God is not anywhere near in this book. So that begs the question. You have just been anointed, the people that are going to be putting the what we call the Bible together. You got all these Old Testament type scrolls that you can pick from. Why pick this one?
I was gonna say, why would they put this in there?
Well, that's a good question. Why do you think they did?
because of the power given to the Jew?
Well, that's part of it, yeah. But remember, no one knows exactly when this book was recorded, as opposed to when it happened. Okay, they're guessing it's close to when the events occurred. Okay, so right after, so the Persians were involved. They had taken over the Babylonians. So what had happened to most of the Jews just before this? Remember, the Babylonians had them in captivity. So when Persia took over Babylonia, what happened to the Jews?
They displaced or enslaved.
Well, they were actually allowed to go home. So a lot of them went home, and a lot of them had an attitude that, son of a gun, they got us again. Okay, son of a gun, they got us again. And oh man, we got our tails whooped. And look at the country we got left here. It's all a pile of rocks and everything, and we got to rebuild this whole mess, and so on and so forth. So here's a book of good news, folks. Here's a book of good news. Hey, we really are worth something. Look at this. We defended ourselves. We're a strong people. We still got it. So, if anything, it might have been a motivational thing, because Esther became one of the 5 scrolls. So it was in a whole lot of synagogues by that time. By the time the canon was put together. And this book became a revered book, even though the word God is not even included in it. So that has a lot to do with it. The other thing that's going on is a lot of the books that we read in the versions that we read them may have been put together when the people were in exile, because they had nothing better to do. And so there was a lot of I don't want to say creative writing, but that's really what it must have been. So keep in mind, the Jews are coming back to a place that looks like, that looked like a war zone, because it was. And what had to happen is there are 2 books, Ezra and Nehemiah, which we should probably look at some point. Ezra was the priest, and nobody had written anything, as far as what the scriptures said or anything else. So it was Ezra's job to figure out how to re-educate everybody. And we're talking about a whole society here, not just a few. And Nehemiah, he was sort of like the military guy. He had to come up with ways to rebuild everything that was laid waste to while they were away. So these 2 guys had to come up with some sort of a strategy to motivate people to get over their sorrows and move on. And when you read books like this, that's one of the things it does.
Do we know what language the original book was written in?
I can look that up for you. See, that's the thing. Most of the ones we look at are actually translated from the Greek. There was around just after the time of Jesus, there was a huge Jewish settlement in Alexandria, Egypt. And one of the things that those people did is they translated most of the scrolls into readable text.
From the originals, then, there had to have been a lot of translation.
Oh yes, oh yes. These were like the learned scholars. Okay, and they translated most of the books that we know today. And remember, there was a lot more than just what you see here. There was all kinds of them. And they had to pick a certain number that they were going to put together, and the rest were, well, I don't know what happened to them. But like in the New Testament, there's probably, for every book that's in the Bible, there's probably 10 of them that didn't make it. And there's all kinds of unusual ones, you know, one that you know, said that Jesus, you know, gave life to a bird when he was 11, you know, so things like that. There's also a book of Thomas, there's a book of a couple of the other disciples that no one knows whether it's for real. That was the big problem. There were so many of them, and they have to go through a very specific process to determine whether these books are legitimate or not. And it's called biblical criticism. So they went, you know, once they did that with all the letters of Paul. The ones you see that are attributed to him are ones, the way they did it is they laid them all out together, and they looked at the sentence structure and how certain words were used and what they meant in each case. And if they were all consistent, then they said, well, Paul obviously wrote these because they all fit. Now, there's books like Hebrews which they say, well, we're not so sure about Paul writing it, because the sentence structure and everything isn't the same. But the Old Testament books, they are what they are. I mean, they were what was in the synagogue. So keep in mind that this was the job that the people that in a little over 1000 AD had to come up with, how to put, what to put in the Bible and what not to. And Esther was put in here. Now, what would you consider Esther? A book of history or a book of something else?
What would the something else be?
Well, that's a good question. That's why I'm asking. The reason I asked that is Esther was put in right after Nehemiah. And it's right before the book of Job. Okay. They wonder today if the book of Job was not a real person, but he was a, shall I say, a caricature to tell us a story. So Esther is kind of stuck between being a historical book and being a book with a message in it. And they didn't really know where to put it, so that's why they stuck it here. Because you know, I'm sure your Bible will show how the Old Testament is structured, and there's the books of the law and the books of the history and the minor prophets and so on. So Esther is just kind of hanging there. And so they're having all kinds of fun trying to figure out, you know, they're trying to figure out whether to put it in or not put it in. And as a result, it was the last book added to the Old Testament canon. Okay? So now the other thing to keep in mind here is that, like I said, this was a book that had motivation among other things. Dave, as I said, Dave asked why the Jews were so hated. Well, this goes all the way back to here. Remember, the Jews didn't exactly walk into the promised land and shake hands and say, we'd like to live here, folks. You know, oh, good, you join us. That's not the way it worked. They conquered the place. So they made enemies. Also, the fact that you had different splits. For example, Jacob and Esau and so on. Remember, Ishmael, the other son of, the other son of Isaac, supposedly is the father of Islam. So there was a lot of hatred going on back then, and that is carried forward to today. Okay, but the Word of God was not in the book, and that's got people surprised. If it's not in the book, then what's it doing in here? Well, it tells you the story of the Feast of Purim, which is a very, very important part of their faith. And naturally, it is in their Old Testament canon because it's part of who they are. Then after that, after all this happens, the Nehemiah rebuilds the city. And I'm going to leave you with one story about how that mattered. There was a movie, wasn't a great one, but it was a nice movie, Facing the Giants. It's about a a football coach in a small private Christian school somewhere in Georgia. Okay, and somewhere in Georgia, and a tiny little place, and he's got no players, and they're having trouble paying him, and they can't have a child, and a lot of prayer going on. And he has to motivate the players that he has, because he's only got like 22 guys on his whole team. So a bunch of these guys have to play both ways. So he uses the story of Nehemiah to do it. He said, because the story of Nehemiah, the way that they built the wall was anybody who had a house, they had to rebuild the wall that was closest to their house. So each person was on the wall putting in bricks, next to every other person. So he told his middle linebacker, "Here, I want you to tell them stone wall. So every player on the line has to put the bricks in to stop what's going on." And naturally, as it turns out, they win the championship, and they have the baby, and everything works out. The coach gets a new truck. It's gorgeous stuff. Mark Richt, who was actually the coach of the University of Georgia at the time, appears in this movie. And there's a lot of side plots that are very, very interesting. It's a good watch. If you have cable, it ever shows up every once in a while.
It, for quite a while, has been a Christian slogan, facing your giants.
Yeah.
Facing your giants, that's a Christian slogan.
Yeah.
And it may have come from that movie, but.
Well, I'm not sure which one did what. It's like,
Yeah, but
it's
a
like,
Christian
who
idea.
came first, Yogi Bear or Yogi Bear Up?
Yeah. Christian slogan, facing your giants.
Yeah, facing the giants, yes.
Yeah.
And so, but the at some point we want to look at that and how those two people had to motivate everybody to get them going. But the exile was a very, very serious thing to the Jews. I mean, it really took a lot out of them. And the stories that happened during the exile, like Daniel's another one, where he ends up in the lion's den, and the three guys end up in the furnace, and so on and so forth. Those are all stories about what happens to them during the exile. Now, coming up, one of the things that Dave wanted to do is look at the book of Genesis to find out what it really says.
Yeah.
That's a lot to read, though. How far are we going in the Bible study? Are we going all through August, July?
No, that's
So we gotta figure that out too. What are we doing?
we don't like to do that through the summer because nobody's ever here. I figured we could go probably for till probably the beginning of June and see how it goes. But one of the things that Dave asked is the story of creation, the story of creation, or is there something else? Is there something else? Is it just the
50 chapters.
Is it just a story of that explains what God did and how He did it? Because it's remember, the word Adam means every man. So I mean, there are a whole lot of unexplained things that happened during that time. But the important thing is, I think we'll see when we study this, it's not what it's what God did. Let's put it that way. Nowhere does it say how God did it. It just says He created. Well, if you create any way you want. And it's not up to us to decide. So if you're ready for Bible study next week, we'll start with that. We're not going to go through the whole book.